Back in 2015, I'd reached my peak fitness. I smashed some half marathons and completed my first marathon later that year. But shortly after that race, everything changed. I decided to focus on sprint distance triathlons, and as I introduced more speed work, I gradually started noticing soreness under that sit bone area. Even to this day, I can vividly remember after my faster running sessions, constantly squirming in my chair just to try to get relief. It took me a while to figure it out because I originally thought it was coming from my glute, but it turns out I had a condition called Proximal Hamstring Tendinopathy, also known as PHT. And what followed was 5 years of frustration. Resting didn't help, stretching didn't help, glute bridges didn't help, and even with my knowledge as a physiotherapist, I still struggled to find a treatment path that could get me consistent results. But even though it took me longer than I hoped, I eventually figured it out. In fact, over the past few years, I've been running fast, lifting heavy, and fitter than I ever have been. And now I feel like I'm ready to share all of my experimentations, setbacks, and epiphanies with you so you don't have to prolong your own frustration any longer. Starting with the struggles I had with sitting. Sitting hurts with PHT because the sore tendon wraps itself under and behind the sit bone, causing it to be squashed between the bone and the seat, kind of like squashing a bruise. This is why harder surfaces are more painful. The first thing I found helpful was sitting on a cushion, and then I found lifting up my chair height and tucking in my feet kind of seesawed the weight off the sit bones, which allowed me to sit longer with less discomfort. During intense flare-ups, I spent short periods with the cushion under the unaffected side, effectively lifting the entire painful sit bone off the seat. However, I was conscious to keep this to a minimum because I didn't want to slouch one way and end up with back pain. I eventually figured out that my sitting tolerance was about 30 minutes, which was how long I could sit, keeping only mild discomfort that didn't cause pain beyond my typical symptoms the following day. With this knowledge, I then rotated between 30 minutes of sitting, 20 minutes of standing, and 20 minutes of kneeling throughout my workday as a way to distribute the load. I didn't want to stand for too long because I have had clients make that mistake and end up with lower back pain or plantar fasciitis. And as my symptoms improved, so did my sitting tolerance, and I created a gradual progression chart, eventually involving more sitting, less standing, and more sitting without a cushion. A lot of PHT sufferers fear sitting, stretching, bending over, and stop doing these tasks altogether. But this is a trap. Completely avoiding these tasks like sitting inevitably decreases your tolerance, and then the return back to sitting becomes harder and harder. I host the Overcoming Proximal Hamstring Tendinopathy podcast, and I constantly talk about this concept, which I call the pain, rest, weakness, downward spiral. One epiphany that really helped me avoid this downward spiral was identifying my level of tolerance and then trying my best to preserve my tolerance without flaring things up. On days when sitting and bending was more painful than typical, I found holding the tendon under tension offered several hours of relief. We generally call these isometric exercises. My main go-to was long lever bridges, 3 sets of 20-second holds, or if I had a chair or a box nearby, I'd press my heel firmly down and hold that for 10 seconds and repeat that 3 times. But I kept reminding myself that isometrics were only a temporary fix. Kind of like taking pain medication for a headache. The pain meds don't heal the headache, but just make things more comfortable so I can get through a busy day. So your next question probably is, well, what does help heal a tendon long term? The answer is slow, heavy, progressive strength training. In particular for me, it was half range of movement dumbbell deadlifts, lowering my hands just past my knees before coming back up, starting with 3 sets of 8 with 20 kilos in each hand. The other exercise was single leg prone hamstring curls, 3 sets of 8 on each side with 5 kilos. I did these exercises 3 days per week, and when it was time to progress, I'd increase the weight, but drop the reps down to 6, and then keep the weight the same and progress up to 8 reps. And then I just followed that pattern until I decided to increase the range of movement. However, be very careful when starting these exercises yourself. A lot of my PHT audience start with these exercises, it flares them up for days, and then they blame the exercise. But it's not the exercise that's wrong. It's likely too much, too heavy, or through a range of movement that is too challenging for your tendon. In fact, it's not uncommon when I work with clients one-on-one to start them at 3 sets of 5, 10 pounds in each hand, and only 1/4 range of movement. I knew I was ready to progress when my pain during the exercise was less than a 4 out of 10, and in addition, there was no increase in my typical symptoms the next morning. At times, this could be hard to interpret, but another epiphany I had was a test I could repeat each day to see if I was back to baseline. And as funny as it sounds, it was actually leaning forward on my affected side to put a food bowl down to feed my dog. If the pain was above typical, it indicated that I had done too much the day before. If it was at my normal mild symptoms, it meant I was tolerating the load. As the weeks went by, the pain during that task became less and less, and so my baseline standards eventually evolved into symptom-free. This was a clear sign that I was on a good long-term trend. But you don't have to do my dog food test. I've had clients do other tests that suit them better, including the heel press test every morning or the shoe off test. But just check in 1 to 2 times per day. Don't obsess over it. After releasing my first PHT video on YouTube explaining the PHT exercises in more detail, I kept getting comments saying I don't have access to weights and asking for home-based alternatives. Look, unfortunately, as I've said before, tendons need slow, heavy, progressive load in order to get the right signal to adapt and increase their level of function, which means bodyweight exercises and banded exercises severely limits your potential to heal. You can, however, invest in adjustable dumbbells, which you can just pick up secondhand, and use these for deadlifts in the comfort of your own home. But investing in a gym membership gives you unlimited upside to progress these exercises. You're probably also thinking, well, how heavy is heavy? The benchmark I gave myself was eventually deadlifting my body weight, which is 75 kilos, for 3 sets of 6. I did achieve this. It did take me 5 months, and years later, this is my current deadlift routine. Don't get me wrong though, my rehab journey wasn't all smooth sailing. But before I share how I managed to bounce back stronger after each flare-up, I want to personally speak to you. Because if you've made it this far into the video, I know you're a part of my people. If you've been struggling with this condition and you're not sure what to do next, I've put together something to help. Linked in the description is a 30-second questionnaire, literally just 6 multiple choice questions, and based on your answers, I'll point you to the most effective next step for your situation. Because over the years, I've created a range of resources, including free information sheets, hundreds of PHT podcast episodes, self-guided online programs, all the way up to working with me directly one-on-one. And I'm proud to say that to date, I've helped over 500 people with PHT. Everything that I've created is aimed to strip away the mountain of misinformation about recovering from PHT and taking out all the guesswork that leaves people like you overwhelmed. If this sounds helpful, click on the link in the description and I'll guide you from there. So like I said, I have had my fair share of setbacks and flare-ups, and a lot of your previous comments were around fear and confusion during these setbacks in your rehab. For me, during each flare-up, step 1 needed to be figuring out what caused the flare-up in the first place. And what I found for me was typically progressing compression-based activities too quickly, which typically involves loading the tendon while the hip is in deeper ranges of flexion. This not only loads the hamstring tendon, but also compresses it into the sit bone at the same time. Through countless flare-ups, I found that my typical culprits were deadlifts, lunges, fast running, and uphill running. But importantly, I didn't remove these tasks. Instead, once symptoms had settled, I took it as a sign of overreaching and recalibrated my dosages with even smaller progressions next time to avoid riskier jumps in the future. For example, I remember having a flare-up progressing my deadlifts from 60 kilograms to 65 kilograms. So once it settled down and I was back to tolerating 60 kilograms, I then made smaller progressions, only increasing the weight by 1 set at a time. This was one of my biggest epiphanies. I shouldn't shy away from tasks that cause flare-ups, especially if they were meaningful to my future goals. Instead, I needed to recognize that particular task as a chink in my armor that I needed to fortify. I can't expect to make a full recovery if I keep steering away from weak links and vulnerabilities. When it came to looking for other patterns in my flare-ups, I also recognized I was repeating this boom-bust cycle, typically driven by my emotions instead of rational thinking, which was a big mistake. It went like this. I'd start to notice improvement, I'd get really excited, and I'd increase my running volume or speed too quickly, quicker than my tendon could handle, and bang, I'd be facing another setback. In other words, I was letting my emotions dictate my training and not the rational, logical path that got me feeling good in the first place. To combat this, and to take my emotions out of the equation, I wrote down my sessions ahead of time, including my running distance, my running pace, and my terrain. I kept telling myself, don't get too cocky, but don't get too scared either. Instead, be rational, consistent, have patience, and trust the process. If this is resonating with you and you want to make the same commitment, leave a comment saying I pledge to rehab smarter. And then go check out that survey in the description and find confidence in your recovery roadmap.